Today, our guest is Stefan Casriel. Stefan is a tech entrepreneur and an investor, and he's the former CEO of Upwork, the world's largest freelancing website. He was a senior director of consumer products at PayPal and is co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the new social contract, and the author of the book Hire Fast and Build Things, which describes how to use distributed remote teams to run businesses and organizations. Hi, Stefan. How's it going?
Hi, Mark. I'm doing great, and thanks for reading this super complex bio. I didn't come up with the title of the World Economic Forum. They have these really complex names, but yes.
I love it. That's great. Well, it's so great to have you. Uh, so one of the interesting things is that when you were building Upwork, you put your ideas about remote teams actually into practice. And so maybe we could just start by having you tell me how you what did you learn from developing tools and practices to enable distributed teams to work together?
Sure. Yeah. So maybe a little bit of background. So Upwork, as you said, is a freelance marketplace. So what the company does is we connect buyers with sellers. The buyers are companies, typically small and medium-sized businesses, but increasingly also very large companies. And the sellers on the marketplace are freelancers. So people who sell their skills online. The biggest categories being software developers, designers, but also lawyers, accountants, consultants, people that do customer support, sales reps, et cetera, et cetera. And as a company, the company today is about 2,000 people, but it's using its own platform a lot. And so of the 2,000 people who work at Upwork, about 1,500 or so are not full-time employees, and they don't work in an office. They're freelancers and they work from home. And I think we stopped counting how many cities and how many countries, because at some point it really doesn't matter. People can work from anywhere and people can work on their own schedule. And we were much more focused on hiring amazing talents and having people that were really passionate about the mission of the company, rather than limiting ourselves to, a 50-mile radius from San Francisco or New York or what have you. So we used to do, by the way, I left Upwork, so I say we, but it's no longer me. But we did a lot of what the industry calls dog fooding, which is using your own product, because if you can't make it work for yourself, it's going to be hard to convince somebody else to do it. Actually, there's a really funny story. Can I tell a funny story about this?
Yeah, of course.
So one time one of our early enterprise customers is Nestle. And one of the brands that Nestle owns is Purina, which is the dog food company. And one time, some of the management team of Purina came to visit our office, and we were talking about how we were using distributed teams and how we were engaging with freelancers and why it made sense and how we made it work for ourselves and the best practices. And I said, we're dog fooding it. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And I'm like, oh, don't worry. This is a weird Silicon Valley expression. It comes from Google and it means, eating your dog food, but we don't mean it literally. We just mean our product needs to be so good that we want to eat it. And they looked at me and they said, like you Silicon Valley people, you think you've invented everything. We invented the concept of dog fooding, but we meant it literally. Like 50 years ago, we said we want to have dog food that's good enough that the human would want to eat it. So there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So the Nestle execs actually have eaten dog food literally.
I don't know if they did or not, but I think the point was make your product be so compelling that you would want to use it, because if it's not good enough for you, it's never going to be good enough for your customers.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I think as an end user, I have used Upwork for a lot of different things: book cover designers, website design, illustrations, copy editing, proofreading. It's great. This is using it as an individual or a small LLC with 3 people. How does a large organization work with a lot of people all over the world? Like, what makes that possible?
Yeah, well, so what makes it possible is the software, right? Fundamentally, like prior to Upwork, finding somebody who might be in another part of the same country, let alone in another country, was extremely hard. And then having the tools to actually collaborate with them was, even harder. And then doing it in a compliant way, this is tied to labor law, and in just about every every country, there are local laws that dictate how companies can work with people. And like nobody wants to be an expert in this. And so finding software like the software that Upwork has built to help the two sides be compliant with their local laws from a tax standpoint, from an employment standpoint, and also from a payment standpoint. The company moves over $2 billion every year, much of which happens cross-border, and that's also a highly regulated industry. So a lot of what the company has done, I would say, falls in two buckets. One is workflow software, so things to make payments faster and more efficient, things to be able to do reporting so that you can do your taxes efficiently and all of that stuff. And then the second bucket is around marketplace processes and specifically matching. How do you find an efficient way for you as a buyer of services to find skilled people to do it without wasting your time reading through hundreds of thousands of resumes? And conversely, for the workers, they don't want to be bidding on 150 jobs in order to get one. And fundamentally, what we do for freelancers is we make it much easier for them to do business development, so acquire new clients as well as re-engage with past clients, and also much easier to do all of the administrative stuff tied to invoicing and reminding people to pay you on time, and then filing your taxes and all sorts of other things that are otherwise super time consuming. And so ideally what the company does is allow people to focus on what they're really good at, which is being an amazing copywriter or an amazing designer, and removing all of the overhead that they would normally have to do if they were a traditional offline freelancer, if you will.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that people are learning during this pandemic about, what are they learning about remote collaboration that will carry over when this is over?
Yeah, so I have an optimist point of view and I have a pessimist point of view on this. So the optimist point of view says we're all going to realize that it works. Like the conversation you and I are having right now feels very natural. And the people that are in the audience who will soon be asking questions probably also find it to be really natural. There's nothing, as complicated as it seems. Initially when you talk about it, you're like, wow, that sounds really difficult. And in practice, it's very easy. Like we have very good video, we have really good audio. Most of the tools that we use these days are in the cloud anyway, whether it's your CRM, your ticketing system, your, development infrastructure and what have you. And so it's not nearly as crazily complex as people think. And there's a lot of myth around how can you innovate this way? How can you be productive this way? How can you have a good culture this way? How can people stay engaged? And I think what companies and workers are realizing right now is all of these are myths. There's nothing really fundamentally difficult or broken about working remotely. And usually one of the concerns that managers have is, how do I know that people are working? How do I know that they're not just, browsing the internet or doing something else? And what we've been saying for years is, look, everybody should be managing by objectives. Nobody should be managing by FaceTime. And generally every manager agrees that it is indeed how you should be managing people. And the reality is just about every piece of research we've conducted, but also other people have conducted, shows that remote workers tend to be as productive, if not more productive than regular on-site workers. And that the real issue is more the opposite. The real issues that people have over time are, they're getting overworked. It's hard to find a boundary between your personal life and your work life if you're working from the kitchen and you're also eating in the kitchen. And B, social isolation, which may have impacts on people's mental health over the long run. We are social animals, and working from home and being completely isolated from each other can be really, really tough. So the optimist view on this is we're going to come out of this thinking like, wow, this was pretty good. And as a result, we're going to allow it more permanently, which will allow people who do not want to live in San Francisco and New York, but have been forced to be there because that's where all the jobs were, to move out. The San Jose Mercury News has this study every year where they ask people, like, if you could keep the same job and the same pay, would you move out of the San Francisco Bay Area? And every year the number keeps on increasing because the cost of living here has become just crazy and congestion has become crazy. And last year it crossed 50%. So 50% of people in the Bay Area are saying, if I could bring my job with me and go somewhere else in the US, I would. And this would be amazing for the Bay Area, and it would be amazing for the rest of the country. Increasingly what's happening is people who live in San Francisco for the most part, have jobs that can be done from anywhere in the state or anywhere in the country. And meanwhile, people whose jobs truly needs them to be in San Francisco, think about people that are in the food industry, people that are in the retail industry, typically have jobs that don't pay nearly as well and can't afford to live anywhere nearby and have super long commutes. So in a happy scenario, companies allow people to delocate, work in another part of the country, which helps reduce the pressure we have on the infrastructure here in the Bay Area and the cost of living and social inequality. And meanwhile, recreates, more dynamic local economies in places like Fresno and Stockton and Modesto and potentially other states as well in the US. So that's the happy scenario. The less happy scenario is where people were forced into it, they didn't choose. Most companies were not prepared for it. Like I was talking to a government agency the other day, they don't even have laptops for their employees. So how do you work from home if the only computer that you've given people is a desktop, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have VPN access, so people can't log in. So companies were not prepared. So people were forced into it, and you don't like things that are forced on you.
Mm-hmm.
Companies were not prepared. You now may have a spouse or a partner at home with you, which your house may not be designed for one home office, let alone two. And then the worst in all of this is you may have kids at home who are supposedly homeschooled, but really in practice are just making you even less productive. And you may be sick, or you may be worried that you're sick, or you may have somebody that you're close to who's sick right now, and you may be scared because the economy is tanking at the same time. And my fear is everybody's going to realize, wow, this whole remote work thing was completely unproductive. Let's go back as soon as the confinement period is over. Let's go back to the real life of all being stuck in an office and call this a dramatically failed experiment. And I'm afraid that because it was not a well-designed, A/B test. We're not testing good remote work against good on-site work. We're testing a, crazy emergency remote work against the good old ways. And I'm concerned that some companies and some workers will unfortunately come to the wrong conclusion that, all this remote work thing does not work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been doing the remote work thing for a really long time, and my kids are a lot older, so that's not a problem. But I think for a lot of people with young kids, that could be one of the main factors that makes work hard for them. Is just the kids aren't in school and they're in a house, and the kids are interrupting or they need attention. Do you see any efforts being made that would mitigate this? Like maybe someone in Fresno or Austin. There could be kind of a shared space where people could go and work and concentrate, but it's not actually an office, but it's something that's very close, and they don't have to be in San Francisco or Manhattan.
Yeah. So, there's what's happening during the confinement period, and then there's what's happening afterwards, right? Right now, we should all socially isolate. And so building a co-working space and having a bunch of people work there, not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also the reason why the kids are all at home. And I would say the best thing we can do at this stage is be really empathetic and really patient with each other. And if you're a manager and you have team members that are struggling because they have kids at home, now is not the time to be a pain in the neck with your employees. Now is the time to be really compassionate and realize what they're going through, because it's the right thing to do. And yes, maybe your company is going to be less productive for the next couple of weeks, not the end of the world, really. After that, yeah, I don't think remote work needs to be work from home. For a lot of people, working from home is socially isolating and they want to have contacts with other people. But that doesn't mean commute for an hour to come to a big office building where for the most part, you're going to be doing video conferencing anyway, because most of the people that you work with are either on another floor in the same building or another building in the same town or even another building somewhere else. And I think there's going to be a place where we build a more distributed infrastructure for work, where there's a lot more local co-working spaces, and you go there partly for social reasons. You meet other people like you. They may not be working at the same company or for the same client, but they're people that have similar lives compared to you and people that you can relate with. And meanwhile, by staying there, you might eat lunch there locally. You might definitely have a lower, better commute. If you take Stockton as an example, population of Stockton is about 300,000 people, of which close to 100,000 commute to San Francisco every day.
Wow.
And if you've ever done that commute, it's really painful.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is if you go at noon in Stockton, the town is empty. It's a ghost town. And if these people worked in local co-working spaces, and there's 2 or 3 that have opened up recently, they might be, getting coffee at the coffee shop, and that would create jobs for baristas. And so not only would it improve the commute of the people that are no longer driving to San Francisco every day, but it would create additional jobs in Stockton. And of course, same is true for other towns in the US as well.
That is really interesting. That the second order effects of this kind of remote working uh, causing smaller or not large urban centers to start to flourish again is really intriguing, I think.
Yeah, it's something that the economists call the local multiplier effect. And what it says is if you put a highly paid worker in a distressed part of the country, on average, they create another 4 jobs. And
That's
the idea
amazing.
being, it's, like trickle down has become a really bad term in corporate America, but that's kind of the original idea. You take somebody who's paid $100,000, they're going to consume goods and services locally, which creates additional jobs, who themselves will create additional jobs. And it makes for a more attractive city, which also then attracts additional talents. There's
Mhm.
been a lot of economic development focused on attracting big corporations, giving huge tax credits to Amazon and to Foxconn and to other big firms to create local jobs. But there's a different approach that's starting to emerge. And Vermont started it, and then Utah did it, and then the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has a version of it, and Tulsa in Oklahoma has it, and additionally, more and more cities and counties and states in the US do this, where they'll give a tax incentive for remote work. And it's either money given to the workers, like if you move to Vermont right now and you bring with you a job from a company that's outside of Vermont, the state will pay you $10,000. Right. And if you ask freelancers, like, would you be willing to move for $10,000? Most people will say, yeah, like, bring it on. And in
Mhm.
fact, when that program got started, they got flooded with registrations, and they didn't have the budget for it. So they had to cut it short because there were just too many people who
Mhm.
wanted to move. And I think that's a much more scalable and cost-effective way to do economic development, as opposed to giving, hundreds of thousands of dollars per worker to the large corporations, because that money only benefits the shareholders at the end of the day. It's a big um, uh, tax drainage from the local economy to Wall Street investors, which does very little to actually benefit the local economy in the end.
That's really interesting. And so that $10,000 basically helps take care of your moving resettlement costs and
Yeah.
everything, makes it really
Yeah,
attractive.
and then the idea is, like you pay local income tax and local state tax, and so you're creating additional wealth in the local economy, plus you create additional jobs through what you do. And if the cities and the counties there are smart, they invest it in making those cities more attractive to, highly skilled, creative people who then choose to move to Vermont instead of moving to Boulder or moving to Portland or moving to Austin or other parts of the country. And you progressively, um, recreate jobs and recreate the local economy. Like Vermont's population has been diminishing in the last, few decades. And with initiatives like this, they think they can bring back some of the people who may have moved to New York or other parts of the country.
It's amazing. So here's a really good question we have from an attendee. How do you convince an employer who went to remote work only because of forced governor mandate that we can successfully do this after the crisis is over?
Yeah, well, so there's plenty of things you can do, right? One thing is vote with your feet, right? If enough of the best talents in a company decide that they want to work flexibly and that they're willing to change employers if their current employer is not willing to let them do it, then the employer will, get the message. Ultimately, we're all in a big war for talent. The best people are a scarce resource. And if the best people are all saying, well, if you're not allowing us to work remotely, we're all willing to go work at this other company that's doing it, then the company will change its ways. Um, Another way of doing it is just to make a compelling case for why it makes sense. So let me give you an example of data point that we've gathered at Upwork over the years. And this is about the freelance population. It's not about the employee population, but I think the numbers are not radically different. When we ask freelancers, like, how much would a traditional employer have to pay you to take a full-time job? About 50% of freelancers say no amount of money. And you say, well, that's kind of weird because clearly there's some amount of money that's going to make you change. And so a couple of years ago, in the study that the company does every year called Freelancing in America, we started asking the question, like, why? Like, why on earth would you not take my money to take a full-time job? And it turns out that about half of freelancers in the US cannot take a full-time job because of physical disabilities. Lots of office environments and frankly commute environments are not designed with people with physical disabilities, or they have mental health issues. So lots of people that, military veterans who have PTSD, or people that are somewhere on the autism spectrum who may be highly qualified to do work, but for whom the office environment is incredibly stressful. People who have care duties, like young kids at home, a sick spouse, elderly parents, or people who just live in a part of the country where there's no jobs. And one perfect example of this tends to be military spouses who, their spouse gets moved from one base to the other, and they have to change jobs every 2 to 3 years. And if you go apply for a job and you say that your military spouse, your employer or the potential employer will say, well, we're only going to have you for a couple of years. We're going to find other people that are completely left behind, even though they may be highly skilled and highly motivated and incredibly hardworking. They're left behind by the traditional job market because everybody wants you to be on site and working full time. And I think like making, just like the case for diversity is not just about doing it because it's right, it's also doing it because it's in your best interest as a company. Like the case for flexible work and the case for remote work is also about inclusiveness and also about access to talent. And so it's really doing good and doing well at the same time. And then I think increasingly there will be shareholder pressure to do this, and there will be consumer pressure to do this because it's the right thing for the economy. And now increasingly it's also the right thing for healthcare. We having everybody be in a big office tower is probably one of the best ways to make those pandemics go even faster because there's just too many people close to each other. The density is just too high. And it's a corporate risk, right? I mean, if all the people that are in the big Salesforce tower behind me in San Francisco, if they all got sick at the same time, the stock price for Salesforce would have probably dropped by a huge amount. So if you're a shareholder, you should be concerned about the idea that it's probably not a prudent strategy to put all of your assets, which are the people, in the same big office tower if it becomes a health risk.
So there's a lot of compelling reasons to continue this move we've had that we've kind of been forced into. One thing that I've noticed is that because this is a new experience for a lot of people, they are trying. They're moving forward with the assumption that they should try to make remote work replicate real life, face-to-face work as much as possible. And I think you would disagree that attempting to replicate a face-to-face meeting as much as possible is not quite the right direction to go in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so first of all, I think it's important to remember we're talking about 25% of jobs in the US, right? So 75% of jobs in the US cannot be done remotely. And even though there's more growth in the jobs that can be done remotely in general than jobs that can't, it's still going to be the case that we really need to think about how we enable the people whose jobs need to be done on site to continue to operate in a way that is, healthy. I mean, the last thing that we would want coming out of this crisis is to further increase social inequality by having a group of people that are typically highly paid that can work remotely and have these amazing working life and amazing health conditions. And meanwhile, 75% of the workforce who has to work on site in situations that are potentially dangerous to their health, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So I think it's really important to remember we're talking about 25% of the workforce. But within that, the vast majority of it historically has not been working remotely, despite the fact that they could. Right? And so I think making sure that we have a place where the 25% of the population that can work remotely is able to do it successfully and can create, have meaningful careers and meaningful opportunities and create value for their companies and their shareholders really matters. And I would say for remote work, just like for many things in innovation, we tend to first have the approach of how do we make it not suck? How do we make it be almost as good as real life? And unfortunately, by doing this, you're always going to have the same ceiling, which is only as good as real life. And generally, if there were like 20 dimensions you can optimize for, and on each of them, at most, you're going to be as good as real life. It's still not going to be as good as real life. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what matters a lot more when you innovate these things is to really think about how do you neutralize as much as you can the things about remote that are never going to be as good as real life. But how do you aspire to be 10 times better on the dimensions where you can be better than real life? And to me, one of the analogies that, you and I, talked about a few days ago is back in the days in UX design, there was this notion of skeuomorphism. And the concept of skeuomorphism was, let's build user interfaces that have the texture of real life elements. And, most famously, the old address book of the iPhone and macOS looked like a Moleskine, contact book, like a physical one. And at the time, the idea was to make it easier for people to relate to the idea that this was the virtual, digital equivalent of the physical address book that you used to have in your drawer. But of course, the reality is that's not the power of it, right? If you just do that, you say, well, but I miss the texture of the page, and I miss being able to flip the pages with my finger, and this used to be so much better. And yet a virtual address book is so much better because I can update my address on your behalf so you don't have to. And by the way, you'll never lose it because it's stored in the cloud. And by the way, if you want to share it with other people virtually, you can. I mean, there's like a gazillion things you can do with a digital virtual address book that you couldn't do before. And by limiting yourself with this, skeuomorphic approach, you're kind of missing all of the 10x opportunities. And I think we're starting to see this in remote collaboration tools. Like, just give you a few examples. There are two tools that people use for virtual whiteboarding and ideation. One is called Miro, and the other one is called Mural. And they're basically like a big whiteboard where you can put sticky Post-it notes. And you could say, well, that's never going to be as good as the real whiteboard. And the answer is yes, it's not. But it's also much better because a real whiteboard is finite. You always run out of space, and you have to kind of erase this place to be able to add more stuff. And now that it's virtual, it can be infinite, and you can zoom in and zoom out in different ways. And then, usually your pens on the real one like run dry, and you only have limited number of colors and all that stuff. And here you can have infinite. And if you don't know how to draw really well, in real life, you look like a fool. And here you can just use clip art. And so there's all sorts of ways in which those virtual technologies are both worse than the real life, but also 100 times better than in real life. And the net of it is it makes them extremely usable in a remote format, to the point where you don't really want to go back. Like, once you're used to some of these tools, you would say, look, even if we're in the same room, let's still use the tool because it saves our data automatically and it's indexable, like it's going to do optical character recognition. And so I'm going to be able to search my sticky notes forever, and I won't have to just, recopy them on my Google Doc or what have you. And so there's all sorts of ways in which we can have a much better future of work by trying to not focus on what's not as good as real life, but instead focus on what are the things we can do 10 times better than in the good old ways of doing it, if you will.
That sounds great. And I just wanted to let attendees know that we'll provide links to all the different resources that Stefan is talking about. If you can just go to the URL anytime and you can easily access those. Stefan, we have another question. This is a really interesting one. What jobs and careers do you see coming out of this remote working boom? And I guess that's jobs that didn't exist before that will be, a second order consequence of a remote working environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the very least, there's going to be trainers and coaches. Like, I remember 10 years ago or 15 years ago when Agile became a thing. Nobody knew how to do Agile development. And there were like people whose job became to train engineering teams on how to do Agile development. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. There are people who work at companies like Upwork, and like, there's about a dozen fully distributed at scale companies now, companies like Automattic and Basecamp and GitLab and Trello and Upwork and InVision and a few others. And the people that have worked there for a long time have seen it work. And some of them want to teach other people how to do it. So I think there's going to be a boom in people whose job is to transform the old way of doing things into the new way of doing things. And beyond that, there's going to be a lot of jobs that are heavily transformed by the fact that you can now work remotely, and it's going to be a new dimension. Like if you're an individual contributor, it's going to feel like you have a lot more flexibility. If you're a manager, it's going to feel like, ooh, yet another thing that I need to worry about, and yet another thing that I need to train myself on. But I hope that people see it as an opportunity to do things better, as opposed to a fear of not being good enough to be able to do it, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another question, and this is from Scott at Scott Miniman, who is a Institute for the Future associate. He worked at Xerox PARC for a long time, and he said that he did a bunch of work there at PARC back in the '80s, looking at what we now call workplace video. One of the most robust findings from this research was that remote work was a spectrum from independent work to focused one-on-one and one-to-many activities. Current technologies for this sort of work are still based on a place a call or distributed meeting model. Do you know of any systems that support the natural drift from vague awareness of your coworkers to ad hoc focused work to scheduled meetings?
Yeah, so well, that's a very deep set of questions. So I think there's it's still the case that a lot of these tools are nascent, and I would say historically, remote work has worked best when everybody knows what they need to do, and people don't have to collaborate too much with each other, and everybody's in individual contributor full execution mode. And the way that works is, like you have a daily stand-up. If you're an engineering team, for instance, you have a daily stand-up. Everybody agrees on what needs to get done. Everybody has their tasks assigned to them, and then everybody goes back to their desk and does the thing completely uninterrupted, and then they meet again the next day. Historically, it's been harder to do highly iterative work where you need to ideate a lot. You don't really know what you're doing. You need to have lots of collaboration. There's a lot of ambiguity in it. And just scheduling a meeting takes time. Like saying who's available in 30 minutes to do a 30-minute call takes you 30 minutes. And so it's highly inefficient. And the more ambient way of collaborating, which is how you do it in real life, if you're a small enough team, everybody's sitting next to each other, and you just turn around and you say, hey, Mark, what do you think about this? And that's not something that historically has been done particularly well with tools. And I would say Zoom as an example, like the tool we're using right now. I can't call you on Zoom, right? We have to schedule a Zoom meeting. We have to agree on the time. And that is not how a phone call works, for instance. And so finding ways that are the right balance between I'm interrupting you and it's super annoying because you're actually busy, versus we have to plan ahead of time for the planning meeting where we agree on the plan, which is super high overhead and really painful for everybody. And there's been a few tools that do the more ambient work. I would say, Tandem would be an example right now of a company that's trying to be a place where you can see what everybody's working on right now and who's being busy and who's not. And you kind of have this norm that says, it's fine for me to call Mark right now because Mark is actually not super busy. But some of it is around the tools and some of it is around the norms. But clearly, if we're going to be doing more of our work remote, we're not always in execution mode, right? There's always going to be some parts of our job where we need to agree on what it is that we need to execute on, and we need to do this better. I would say almost all of the remote first companies that I've talked to in the past have face-to-face meetings from time to time. And I can tell you, at Upwork, for instance, we had a budget to do meetups where if a given team was starting a brand new project and they didn't know exactly what they wanted to do and they were really in their figure it out mode, they would go rent an Airbnb in Istanbul or in Bucharest or in Buenos Aires, or a place that was, a nice place so that they could, hang out and discover the city, but also a place that was convenient for everybody to get to. And they would rent an Airbnb and stay there for a week or two and code during the day and socialize in the evenings. And that tended to be super effective in terms of aligning everybody, building the social connections that made it easier for people to have conflict and to communicate with each other. And it was also a huge perk. People would say, wow, this is amazing. This company is paying me to go to Bucharest and, Madrid and other cool places in the world. And frankly, it wasn't that expensive at the end of the day. Now, clearly, in the virus world where we're all in confinement, we can't do that right now. And we need to make the best we can with the tools. And I would say between things like, Loom and Remote HQ and Miro and Mural that I mentioned, and Tandem and a few other tools, there's more than just Google Docs and Zoom and Google Calendar and Gmail. There's a next generation of tools out there that were designed by people that have been working remotely for a long time and who have identified the limitations of the previous generation of tools and are building the next generation of tools to address those limitations.
That perfectly leads into our next question from Marina Gorbis, our executive director. Um, she'd like to hear a little bit more about the upcoming tools, the innovations in these tools, and if there are any new online tools or companies that you're really excited about.
Yeah, I think, I mean, all the ones I just mentioned, I think are amazing. Like Loom is, some of them are super simple, right? You wonder like, why on earth have we not built them before? So uh, Loom is a video voicemail, right? So basically, like in Zoom, you have to schedule a meeting. We both need to be there. If you're not here, if you don't show up, then what am I supposed to do? And it's super high overhead. And I just had this 5-minute conversation I needed to have with you. In fact, it wasn't even necessarily a conversation. I had 5 minutes of things to tell you. And I could type them up, but the information density of typing them up, like it takes me forever to type up a 5 minutes voicemail, and it takes you forever to read it. And on top of that, it's not that memorable. I can just video, a tiny video of my face, me talking to you, and potentially what's on my screen. So I might give you a demo of what's broken in the current mobile app or what I'd like to see in the design. And so it's kind of my screen plus my face as a video message. It can be transcribed so that it can be stored, forever, and you can search for it in the future. You can share it with other people. It could be the training for new employees. I mean, there's all sorts of like really amazing ways that people use tools like Loom. And you don't necessarily think about it when you're in the office, but even in an office environment, they make a ton of sense. And companies now use it for, onboarding their new employees or for training their sales team, or even for, their customers. The time when you had to travel on site to go train your customers on your product is long gone, even prior to the current situation. So you were doing it on the phone, but frankly, like doing it on the phone, in many cases, forces you and the customer to be available at the same time, when really what you were going to do anyway was essentially broadcast information to them, and they were going to have to share it with a bunch of other people anyway. And so you use tools like Loom to be able to do this. But I would say there's like an entire generation of startups right now, and probably we haven't even seen the beginning of it, because in the last 3 weeks, ever since people have been stuck at home, I'm guessing they're all using these current tools, and they're like, oh my God, I need to fix this and I need to fix that. And so I think in 3 months, we're probably going to see a bunch of others, but there's just in the last, 6 to 12 months, we've seen a next wave of the post-Zoom, post-Slack state of the world, if you will.
What tool would you recommend for a team? It could be a team within a larger organization that wants to track the progress of a project.
Well, there's tons of tools. I mean, some of them are well established, right? I mean, people have been using Asana and Trello and Basecamp, or Jira, or like there's a whole series of tools to be able to do this. I mean, I think that to-do lists in general, like shared team-based to-do lists, has always been one of the things that keeps getting reinvented every couple of years, because it's all about personal productivity. Personal and team productivity is something that's an obsession for most engineers. We hate wasting our time. We hate meetings. We hate overhead, and we really like to be productive. And so anything that makes us feel like we're more productive is something that we spend time on. And so a ton of engineers, just as their side project, want to codify the workflow that they're using anyway into a product that they then ship to other people.
Yeah, I feel that a lot of these tools, and we've tried several, they require people to like spend quite a bit of time understanding how the task managing system works. Pretty simple ones like I think Trello don't require as much, but do you see a time when these things have uh, the capability to allow people to start using them right away without really like, undergoing training to understand how they fully work, or is that just
Yeah,
part of the
you know,
deal?
it's well, it's that's a great question, and I think fundamentally it's a question of how deep does the tool go, like how opinionated is the tool on what is a good way of working versus how flexible is the tool and they let you figure it out, and I would say on one side you have like maybe version 1.0 of Asana, like at the very beginning when it was just purely like a personal to-do list, and nobody needs to get trained on that. Like it's very clear what it does, but it's also incredibly limited in scope. And then on the other extreme, you would have Basecamp, which is everything, right? Basecamp can be your shared calendar, your shared project management tool, your file sharing infrastructure, Google Doc replacement, etc., etc. But as a result, it kind of forces you to use it the way the founders and the designers want you to use it, because it's their workflow. It's not your workflow, and you can customize it to your way, but then you have to learn how to customize it. And I think there's a natural tension between those two things. There's no right answer. I mean, that's the reason why both sets of tools exist. They're very narrow and very easy to use tools. WhatsApp being an example, right? Like everybody knows how to use WhatsApp. They don't get trained on it, versus the power tools. People who use Superhuman are completely obsessed with Superhuman and wonder why on earth anybody would want to use standard Gmail anymore. But before you sign up for Superhuman, you'll actually have somebody to train you on how to use it, because if you just use it on your own, you're going to be missing out on the power of it, because it kind of forces a process on you. It's only gonna work well for you if you use it the way they intended for you to use it.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about Superhuman, because I think that's really an interesting new way to manage email that will become more important as people work remotely.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we all love to hate email. Like everybody's been trying to kill email for 2 decades now. Slack famously for a while said that they were killing email, and the reality is email refuses to go away. And so probably the real innovation will continue to be how do you make it how do you make it less painful for you to work in email. And generally I would say there's two classes of remote work tools. They're the tools that try to promote synchronous work, Zoom, and the tools that want to promote asynchronous work, Loom. And it's Slack versus WordPress, or Gmail versus chat, or and so obviously the ultimate asynchronous work tool remains email. The idea that you're not expected to write super short emails, even though that's typically still a best practice, and you're not expected to reply to an email within 2 minutes. It's totally fine that you only look at your emails, 4 or 5 times a day. In fact, it's probably a best practice that you turn off the notification that says you have new email that forces you to interrupt whatever you're working on to go look at what that email might be. And so email is really like the ultimate asynchronous communication tool that does not make it be a beloved tool. Like generally people hate their inbox. And for a lot of people, it feels like that game of Tetris where, as you remove emails at the bottom of the list, there's new ones coming in. And during the day, it seems like the stack keeps on getting longer and longer, and it's stressful and it's overwhelming. And so there's all sorts of best practices over the years that have been created, the zero inbox, the GTM, like delegates, archive, schedule, and all those kinds of best practices. And a lot of the tools are there to try to bring that process into the product itself, as well as increasingly use AI to try to make decisions on your behalf. And you see it even in Gmail itself. Like increasingly, when you reply to an email, as you type, Gmail will auto-populate what they think you're going to be typing next. And it's a little bit freakish how predictable you are. But it's also super time-saving, right? Instead of writing the same thing over and over again, you can just auto-complete and send the email much faster than you would. And then there's other tools that will try to prioritize your inbox for you, or be much better at spam filters. The guys from Basecamp are working on a tool right now called Yes. I believe it's called Yes, which nobody knows exactly what it's going to do, but it's meant to be much more about permission-based emailing, where if you don't want to hear from brands, as an example, they don't, show up on your inbox constantly. And conversely, if you really want to be notified as, trying to get an answer from you, you're not missing it because of 200 other emails that you have in your inbox.
And so specifically though, how does Superhuman work at
Yeah, well,
approach?
so it's, so it's a highly premium system. Like most people don't want to pay, I don't even know what the price is these days, like $20 per month in order to have a better email system. But it's like there's a lot of keyword shortcuts. There's a lot of like UI changes that make you more productive at, going through your inbox, getting it down to 0, responding to the emails that you need to respond on, delegate work to other people, et cetera, et cetera. And it's it's the one that's currently super fashionable. Like somebody else will come up with something else in the next 2 years. But it's clear that for people that have massive numbers of emails in their inbox, Gmail tends to not do what people want.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another question from Sylvia. I hope I get your last name right. Galliser. Sylvia asks, we can wonder whether remote working and distance learning through online tools can transpose all functions of human interactions, such as brainstorming, critical thinking, demonstrating body language nuances, etc. Do you think there is still a hidden part of human conversations that doesn't go through current tools and would be the tools of the future to address that aspect, I guess, and what would be the tools of the future to address that aspect?
Yeah, so for sure. But so I would say before even answering that question, I think like making the best of the tools you have really matters. So like give you an example, you have a professional microphone in front of you, you have really good headsets. I don't, these are just AirPods. I hope that the sound is good on my side, but I'm pretty sure the sound is better on your side. And so I would say if we're going to be doing this seriously, like having a true home office equipment, where you have a big screen and you have good internet access and you have, like just buy good enough tools to really be able to do it professionally. Beyond that, I would say the tools are still not as good as they need to be. And like perfect example, video conferencing does not protect, like eye contact in the same way that regular room conversations do. The angles are wrong. So right now there's just the two of us. We don't see the audience. But if we saw the audience, they would probably think that I'm looking at them right now, even though I'm looking at you. And that cue actually matters because it tells you whether you can have a conversation with somebody or not. Like if I'm looking at Jenny here, Jenny thinks she can probably interrupt me, or that it's normal for her to be the next person to talk. But really, I'm talking to you right now. And if Jenny starts talking, it's going to be super awkward for everybody. And so things like people are not the right size, they're not the right angle, and we don't know who's looking at whom is a real problem in traditional video conferencing. There's a super high-end tool by Cisco called Telepresence, which nobody can afford to have in their home. I don't know what the pricing is these days. It used to be about $100,000 per room. But the idea, it's amazing. If you've never seen it and you get a chance to see it, it's incredible. The idea is you're in a room and you're talking to people that are in another room that looks exactly like yours because it's been custom made to be exactly like yours. And they're on an LCD panel. As far as you're concerned, they look like they're on an LCD panel that's exactly the right size and exactly the right angle, meaning that they are life size. And if I look at Jenny, she knows that I'm looking at her, and you know that I'm looking at her, and you know that she's looking at me. And so that makes a lot more of the real life closeness where the body language makes a lot more sense than when you're this huge face on the screen that's kind of looking at a weird angle. So can we build that at scale, for less than $100,000 would be, clearly an opportunity. But a next generation of this is how do you do this in augmented reality and virtual reality? A lot of the AR, VR technology right now is being used for entertainment and gaming, and that's cool. But if we're all going to be working remotely, we need to figure out how we make the hardware be comfortable enough that we might be willing to wear it for multiple hours at the same time, and also make the software be compelling enough that it makes sense to do it. And there's at least two areas where AR and VR can really make it, compelling, more compelling than traditional, video conferencing. One is around rendering of virtual objects. So if we're doing industrial design as an example, and we're looking at this, 3D model of a car that we are trying to build right now, not having to do a 3D printer to actually have a real model, that takes, a few hours or a few days to build, but actually do it purely from a CAD design and being able to collaboratively look at it and manipulate it in 3D using augmented reality is powerful. It's better than what you can do in real life. So that's one area of development. The second one is around telepresence. Famously, Microsoft had a project that unfortunately they never productized called HoloPort. And HoloPort, beyond the Star Trek analogy, was the mix between HoloLens, which is the augmented reality goggles, and the Kinect cameras. And so the idea was you put yourself in a room and you put 6 Kinect cameras around you. And what they do is they basically capture you in 3D and remove you from the background, right? So with enough cameras, they know what's you and what's just random stuff around you, and they have enough angles and they can take you in 3D. And they basically created a 3D virtual image of you and streamed it to somebody else, HoloLens augmented reality goggle. And what that did was, if it was set up properly and we didn't do too many weird things, we could be in a room where there's a bunch of chairs in front of me, and some of them are filled by real people that are life size, and some of them are filled by virtual people that are the people being streamed through the Kinect, through the internet. And as long as I have the goggles on, it feels to me like everybody's in the same room. And again, everybody's the right size and everybody's the right angle, and body language is maintained properly and all that stuff. And unfortunately, that never got productized, but it's only a matter of time before the hardware is good enough, the software is good enough, and there's a compelling enough business case that people actually start to build this stuff.
That's great. We're running close to time, so I just kind of wanted to close by asking you a question about if you could give us a book recommendation of a book that you've recently read that inspires you about the future.
Oh, wow. A book about the future. So here's a book I read recently. I don't think I'm going to answer your question properly because I'm trying to think about one that inspires me about the future. But there's a book I read recently, which if people operate a marketplace like I used to, I found it to be an amazing book to read. It's called Who Gets What and Why. Mm-hmm. And it's really about the intersection between game theory, auction theory, and behavioral economics applied to a lot of real life examples. And one of the examples that it's written by an economist, and one of the things he worked on was the way to encourage people to do kidney donations and the compatibility between donors, and essentially creating incentive programs to do it at scale in a way that never happened before. So it's a fascinating book, and I find maybe it's not about the future specifically, but it's about human creativity and ingenuity, like towards a real life problem, which is people are dying because there's not enough donors, finding incredibly compelling and creative ways of changing consumer behaviors to encourage things that are not natural, like donating an organ to a complete stranger does not come natural to people.
Mm-hmm. So the book's called Who Gets What and Why.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds really great. I just wanted let people know that next week, the 4th episode of Online Collaboration, I'll be in conversation with Tara Brown of Safecast. She's an environmental technologist, a STEAM educator, CEO of @GitHub. She'll be discussing the value of crowdsourcing data and community organizing to create real-world resources and keep people safe in times of crisis. And that will be 5 p.m. Pacific, Thursday, April 1st for that one. This one has been really fascinating. Stefan, thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts and ideas. Really interesting hearing from someone who has been kind of at the forefront of online collaboration and distributed team building for many years now. So what you've said has been particularly interesting to me, and I'm sure to all of our attendees. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, for the opportunity, and goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.